Welcome back to Let's Talk Value podcast series. It's my special pleasure today to welcome longtime friend and colleague Michele Schmidt. Hi, Michele.
Hi, Verena. It's wonderful to be here today.
So I think talking about ways to cooperate in healthcare and work across really a multitude of different stakeholders. And obviously there are the 5 Ps: patient, provider, pharma, payer, and policy. But it's also internal in an organization. We also have a bunch of stakeholders, and I'm not using yet the word silos. Maybe we silos, but so it's kind of both external and internal. And I think Michele is super, super well positioned to share with us some of her deep experiences on what are some tips and tricks that really work well or pitfalls. So well, formally again, I can't, tell all the great pedigree that Michele has in the industry. Started off as a nurse, really a clinician and practitioner, and knows the problems on the ground, and really gained more and more responsibilities in clinical research and portfolio management. And now she's senior vice president of asset and portfolio management at Daiichi Sankyo. So thank you, Michele, for being here.
It is my absolute pleasure. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And at the end of the day, if we can find a way to make well-being better for patients, I think we have to do that. And we can only do it by collaborating across the 5 Ps or actors, as you call it. It just has to happen.
Thank you. And I know you wanted to mention a brief disclosure, because obviously
Yes.
we hear from who you are foremost, but we all have affiliations and our duties
Yeah.
too. So please
Yes,
go.
thank you. So please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely mine and do not reflect the views or opinions of Daiichi Sankyo, who is my current employer. Thank you.
Perfect. So let's start. As always, our audience knows I like to ask that easy and difficult question at the same time.
Yeah.
What does value mean to you in healthcare and medicine, maybe, Michele?
Yeah, so I think this is the central question. And for me, value is really about well-being. But when I think about well-being, it's about well-being for patients and their families. So perhaps it is the nurse background of mine, but I don't think about the patient as a singular person, but rather the patient and their family, which is whatever they define their support system as, aka a family, is really how we have to think their well-being as they define it. That is something that is viable long-term. It's really about the well-being is about an enhancement of their life. And it's not a trade-off across the 5 Ps, that the provider, the payers, pharmacy, the policymakers. They really shouldn't be caught in between of this struggle, but rather giving the why or the reason for us to work together to form that cooperation together. So it's about well-being, and we need to use that as our fuel and energy to find that cooperation that is really important across the healthcare ecosystem.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And I think, and I know we'll get to one thing that you just said in the opening before I started, how is this possibly going to work, right?
Yes.
But I think one trick then also in our consulting work at 5P Healthcare Solutions, practically speaking, we actually gather and ask exactly that why question. So what is the purpose and what is it we want to get at? And something that you very nicely said, and it's going to lead me to my next question. So well-being for patients and their support system. But really, if it makes sense for the well-being of the patient, the family, it should also make sense for everybody along the value chain, and not only for those patients. So I think this is, and if we anchor it around our common why and purpose, we usually get there. So in your current role, it's not necessarily around which company, but like in the function of asset and portfolio management on the pharmaceutical side, on the private side, how would you understand in your team's value over there?
Yeah. So I think so value for our teams has got to center back on that patient and family unit. And it can't be just a word. It really has to have a meaning. And I do think, in my current role, my team runs the global project teams, which are a bunch of cross-functional experts, right? In the pharmaceutical business. When I was a nurse, I think we called them multidisciplinary teams, right? So working across even this smaller ecosystem of pharma, how does that translate, that idea of working cross-functionally with this central purpose of creating value for the patients and their family? How do you then take it from this microcosm of just a project team and move that bigger and bigger into the bigger ecosystem? This should be more easily translated, right? This should be, if this is how we're used to working, translated. But I think that sometimes we lose sight of really why we're doing it, and that remembering that each of these pieces of the healthcare ecosystem have that same vision in mind. And that slowing down, and I don't mean slowing down in years, I mean slowing down in minutes, to just hear that and to remind ourselves is important of that. Because even if you haven't been a direct patient care provider, you've more than likely either been a patient or taken care of someone who's been ill or needed help. So everyone, that's a common relationship for everyone, and should be the energy and the fuel for that cooperation. So that's how we think about it in pharma. And we talk about patients a lot too, to make it real.
So that's a great segue when you say we're talking about it. So how do you practically in the day job, because it's, and you alluded to something, it's so tempting in the day job to get distracted from our initial why and purpose. And probably in a quiet moment when we ask, oh, what's your purpose? Well, it's very easily around patients and stuff. Then we go back and we need to deliver a budget sheet, or the clinical trial is not enrolling, or the diligence is late, or then these day things come into our way. So what are some of, because you sit in your function, as you said, in the middle of the, call it multidisciplinary or cross-functional or whatever the latest buzzword is.
That's right.
So what are your tips and tricks for others to keep us centered on what our ingoing purpose and idea and why was? How do you do it in your
but because this kind of negotiation that we have to work on happens within these small project teams, and some of them are not so small, but if we can't find that way within our own team, we can't then translate that to the bigger team, right, of the bigger healthcare system. I think, there was a part in the book of It Takes Five to Tango where you say, focus on the patient and the rest will follow. And I thought, yes. So how do we stay focused when trials are not enrolling? The budget may need to be increased. A million issues that could occur. It's about bringing it back to the why we are doing this, and almost being open to different ideas and different ways of exploring that. And the way you do that is you don't sit in a four-walled room by yourselves and figure that out. You reach out to your partners across the healthcare ecosystem and say, here's the challenge that we're having today. But not just asking the question, but listening and really digesting what you're hearing, whether it be from even a different team in your own organization, but also, I think most importantly, what are you hearing that's happening either with patients? And I think this is an important area that is, you're seeing it at the regulatory agencies around the world. You're seeing it in a number of pharma, bringing the patients and their families into these discussions, hopefully early on, not when there's a crisis. but also hearing from the providers, whomever they may be. But the policymakers as well have a big influence here. We have to kind of try to solve these problems together. And I think that goes for all parts of the 4 pieces of the 5 Ps to benefit the patient.
And I'm fortunate enough among many colleagues who have worked with Michele Schmidt in the past, but I've seen you in action, obviously. We have worked on a public-private partnership project and research deeply together. And I've seen you reach out to external to the company, the organization people. And in this case, it was a clinical study group and physicians and researchers, and really create that sense of partnership and common purpose. But then almost have the courage to just behave with them just the same way you would with your own colleagues. And then make it a real partnership, even if they are tough conversations to have. And like, hey guys, we need to call you because actually we need to come and do an audit in your place, desktop audit. And so but it's when you start talking about the real problems and the real situation, that's when it becomes real cooperation and real partnership and go out there. So what you say, go out there, reach out, bring in the patient, or you spoke about regulators or other people. It's really not only having the sentence in your weekly email to the teams, but actually do it and
do it. Make it personal. I think sometimes would we be more open to different ideas if the patient was sitting in the room with us or their family member was sitting in the room with us, right? For all of us, each one of those actors, like how would we would hope it would be the same, but could you imagine? And sometimes we need that reset of thinking about what if that was you or a family member or just any patient in that conversation. But speaking about, our collaboration that we worked on, that was such an amazing learning experience. And I couldn't help as I read your book, and I'm such a fan, I have to tell you, it really gave me lots to think about, gosh, if I would have known, this relationship with us lasted over 10 years. And in the beginning, early on in my career, I thought, well, this is what I need for this protocol. And for this, it was a lot of I or we, meaning we, the company, needed. And I thought later on, you realize, well, that's great, but what does your collaborator need? Right? And how do you start to understand their needs and their objectives? And honestly, what this really takes, kind of as I think about it, was like 3 things. 1, the word listen. Obvious, right? But there is a certain common vocabulary that you speak about in the tango, but you do have to establish some new common vocabulary, or maybe what they mean, right? So what that means to collect adverse events for me might mean something different to our collaborator. So it's not just the vocabulary, but the common definition of what you need or why you need it. And so kind of really listening, but also bringing in the non-obvious collaborators into that discussion, right? So it's obvious clinician to clinician, regulatory to regulatory, stats to stats, but maybe the finance people need to hear this and listen to, and our team in legal, right? Everybody.
I'm always a big fan.
They're like some of my great friends, but they need to be fair for them to be able to represent us as the ecosystem. They need to hear those conversations, listen, and then really develop that kind of second thing of time and trust, right? No one has time. But you will have time when you have to fix it later. So really, I thought by taking the time to establish relationships and trust, it's definitely not the easy button. It definitely takes time, but the return on investment is tremendous. And we have made great strides, I think, through the pandemic, which I know many of us have reflected on. And I think us being able to have this Zoom podcast is amazing, but there is a lot of value to building trust in a face-to-face relationship. And that means getting on a plane and flying somewhere. I think you need to do that and take the time to build that trust. So when the conversations get difficult, and they will, you already understand, have a better understanding of your collaborators' point of view, and you can speak more plainly to solve the problem, right? Because that patient is sitting there waiting for us. And then really the third thing I thought about was really seeing the possibilities, not the barriers. And, when I picked up this book, I thought, okay, how are we going to manage this master ecosystem of healthcare? And my main takeaway was really, well, stop seeing what the barriers are and start seeing the possibilities. And I think that is where we got to in our collaboration, which was there are barriers. It sounds a little bit like rainbows and sunshine, but you're not going to fix the entire healthcare system with the easy button, but rather, where do you see the opportunities? Acknowledge the barriers and start getting to work, as opposed to letting those barriers continue to push you backwards. I was stunned in your book when I read it was 1925 in Science and Innovation that they talked about telehealth. Yeah. I couldn't believe it. I thought almost 100 years later, and of course the technology.
And a pandemic later, or two pandemics. Yeah,
no, two, that we finally were able to do this. And I thought, can we wait for 100 years each time? Were there things that we could have done before this pandemic, at least to make it maybe 75 years?
And I want us to pause on what you really said, and we're not going to disclose who, what, where, country, whatever, but I want to make for at least the clinical research people on the call, or startup drug developers, to give you a real example on what Michele is describing and that we lived. So we were partnering with a large study group on a registration trial with a new drug. And then we figured, well, that group didn't have any standard operating procedures in place because it was an academic group. They didn't really need to. It was a different time with less regulatory requirements. So our company then said, no, we cannot partner with that group because they don't have the required CQA and quality control standards. So in a traditional transactional way,
yes,
that would have been a no. That collaboration would not have occurred because there was a regulatory barrier, there was a QA barrier, then there was a little bit of a cultural barrier. Oh, anyway, these people can't be trusted, and then you make it up. So it was all what Michele said, it was only barriers. And then maybe Michele and I and
many others,
we said, no, we don't take no for an answer here. It's like, so we phone and eventually jumped on a plane and went there and said, this is what we observe. For us, it would be really important to have that clinical quality control environment. And we believe this is why the legitimacy is for the regulatory environment and health authorities. It should be there. And then they said, oh, actually, this is a really good idea. So then we need to build one. And it's like, okay, great. So all of a sudden, different conversation. And 5 years later, they would thank us because they would build that function that they didn't think of before. That is what we mean. And that's what Michele so nicely said. How can you turn it from stop thinking about barriers and go on a plane and go there and discuss with the people and listen?
Yeah, and not assume that it can't be done. It is definitely one of the best organizations I got to work with.
Yeah. Now we'll move on. So I always have a little bit of an IT and digital flavor, obviously, to our conversations, because luckily now, compared to 20 years ago, electronic data capture is so much more advanced, and standards are more advanced, and even hardware IT intercompatibility issues are better. So anything that you focus on or that you can share in terms of IT software support that's really important to make the mass analytics of data, capturing more tangible and turn it from a barrier to an enabler.
Yeah. So I think number one, the guiding principle has to be how do you make the repetitive and mundane how do you leverage digital health or AI in that way? Well, obviously keeping patient privacy protected during that. And I think that is kind of an easier reach than others. There are certainly a number of digital health solutions that we think about when we think about how we help patients, whether that be using big data in integrating data across a number of different trials using that real world evidence. We are hearing more and more about this. I'm really interested in how we get electronic health records speaking directly into the electronic data capture. That is an area of, I think, repetitiveness opens up more quality issues and it helps, but recognizing that there are IT barriers to that and patient privacy concerns that you highlight in your book around infrastructure. And I was really excited about this Fed AI that's coming up. And just today I see Sanofi and Flatiron Clinical Pipe are going to work together to try to move that into real world. I think saving the time of the coordinators at the site, increasing accuracy of data is important. I think as we speak about the healthcare ecosystem today, what I know, come to understand pretty globally is the staffing challenges that are still resulting from the pandemic. And so how do we support that staff in a better way so they're not doing routine, mundane tasks, like repetitively putting in what's your name, what's your date of birth. There's no need for that to be done. And I think in our own lives, right, being able to look up your COVID test online was very simple now, which it wasn't before. So those are the things I think we can focus on, and taking small bites at the apple to bring, use technology to bring things closer to the patient, to make their lives better, but also for the providers. I mean, we've all been there of swimming in that paperwork, or now it's digital work. How do you leverage that and use that to ultimately have you spend more time with the patients and their family, which make you better providers when you can listen to them? But the overwhelming fact is right now that is huge for our providers.
Yeah, and I like that kind of the taking off the repetitive tasks and things you automate to give that back that time. That's what I always love about Eric Toppel's book, Deep Medicine, and that it actually brings back the human touch, and it's not actually making
it's
actually the opposite. It's like alleviating tasks for highly qualified people to do more important things with other people. This is always, as I'm saying, the shocking moment in the podcast when I'm looking at time and we have, I think we've just started barely scratching the surface on some things, but it has turned out that kind of 20 minutes plus or minus is a good attention span for.
Yeah, that's true.
And maybe for ourselves too. But so, yeah, it's like to close, anything that you really wanted to say and you weren't able to say yet in the time until now, and that you want to leave our listeners and public with before we
go? I would say, Verena, I think bringing this to the forefront, which we all know that we need to collaborate together, but being more thoughtful and purposeful about how we can understand the other collaborators' views, that we all do. I like how you have the patient in the center. We all, without question, we all focus on that, on that person and their family. But to not lose sight of that and use that as your energy and fuel to find new ways to collaborate, cooperate, to make life better for them. I know we can do it. And this was a great reminder to do that.
Thank you very much, Michele Schmidt.
Thank you, Verena.